All right. Sounds good. Thank you, Melanie, and thank you, Suzanne, again for the introduction. So our first panelist that I want to introduce today is Dr. Lynn Kuntz. She's an economist with the National Park Service. Her office is around the corner from Melanie and Larry and our office, so it was a little easier to recruit her. She's an economist, as I said, with the National Park Service in the Social Science Program here in Fort Collins. Lynn provides economic expertise and technical support to parks and leadership on a variety of issues. She's responsible for the annual visitor spending effects analysis, which measures how park visitor spending cycles through the local economies, generating business sales and supporting jobs and incomes. So I will pass it to you, Lynn, for your brief presentation.
Thanks, Joel, and thanks everyone. I'm happy to be here to give you a brief overview of our model. I'm going to share my screens here really quick. Okay. Can everybody see that?
That looks good.
And you can hear me? Okay, great. Okay, so I'm going to just briefly kind of give an overview of our model that we use for measuring visitor spending effects. And just to back up just really quick, is for economics in the Park Service, it gives us this way to kind of communicate the many ways in which parks provide value to visitors, communities, and the public. And we, as economists, we think of it, we have two different buckets here. We have this kind of contributions to the economy, like these financial dollars, benefits to communities. And then also we have the benefits to people. And that's as people travel from around the world to come and see our national parks, and they get value above and beyond what they actually spend in the community. So we have these two different buckets, and today I'm going to be talking about the contributions to the economy, the dollars. And within that, parks generate economic activity in many ways, and they support economic growth and jobs. And the kind of the main ways that we look at and measure is by, as we've been talking about, this kind of the spending by visitors and communities near parks. As people travel to parks, they spend money in the hotels and restaurants. Parks also generate economic growth by purchasing supplies and services for park operations within local communities. And then employees of parks and of park businesses, they spend their money in the local communities. So that's another way that parks can support economic growth. And then as we repair buildings within the park and roads, that also generates additional dollars. So those are ways that we can look at these kind of contributions of parks. And today, I'm just going to briefly talk about the spending piece. And so we have our model is the visitor spending effects. It has a long history, and we have documented peer-reviewed methods for measuring and reporting this economic contribution of visitors in this kind of the local area around parks. We've been doing this since the 1980s, so it's got a long history. And it started originally with just like individual parks for helping with management plans and looking at how things are changing just at the park level. We've updated and improved these methods over the years. And since 2005, we've been producing an annual report. And within our annual report, we look at the gateway communities. We also then aggregated the parks within each state. And then we also then look at the national over the impact of these of all parks within the nation. And we've got 3 model inputs that I'm going to quickly touch on and that we need to be able to produce these estimates. And the first inputs is we need to know how many visitors are at each park. And fortunately, we have a way to do that. As you know, people travel to parks and enter parks in various different ways, boats, cars, by foot. Fortunately, we have a visitor use statistics office program that helps parks collect their visitation information. And we have this website here, and you can go to this website and you can go to a state and then go to a park, and you can see how each park collects visitation information. We have monthly and annual visitor statistics for most of our parks, 385 out of the 423 units. Some parks are new and not online yet, and some other parks are in conjunction with other federal lands. So we don't have every park, but we have most of them. And so we have the monthly recreation visitation, annual visitor stats for all these parks. And when you go to a park's webpage, you can actually see their methods for how they count visitors. So that's one piece that we need. The second piece is we need to know how much visitors are spending, and we need to know their trip characteristics, like how long they stay, all that. So we do that through visitor surveys. So here's just an example of one of our surveys questions that we use to ask about how much they spend in the local area. We also ask, we provide a map that shows what we're talking about in terms of the communities that we're considering local. So we want to know how much they're spending on gas, hotels, all these different categories. And then besides that, we also ask about their trip characteristics. We need to know, did they spend the night in the local area? Did they camp or did they stay in a lodge? How many days did they spend? How many people are in their group? Once we have all this information, we're able to come up with a spending profile for each of the different types of visitors. So we know, like, here's an example of, so a person from that local area, they don't spend money on hotels, and they usually stop at a restaurant. Sometimes they do a guide. So we have like their average spending per party day per night for local visitors, for visitors that stay within lodges within the parks, with those that stay in hotels outside the park, those that camp. So that's the information we need to be able to make our estimates. And then the last piece of information we need these economic multipliers, and we have models to do this. And what a multiplier is we have cartoons to explain it. As visitors travel and they stay in the local area, they then shop at local businesses, and make purchases, and these are what we consider like direct effects of visitor spending. So that's the first piece. And then as these businesses, they'll have to purchase additional supplies from other businesses, and that's what we consider an indirect effect. And then as this kind of multiplier ripple effect through the economy, as these businesses, the workers at these businesses, they'll then go and spend their money at other local businesses, and that's called an induced effect. So we have a model that fortunately does all these kind of models all these complex interactions, and that is what we need to produce our estimates. So once we have all three pieces, we are able to show visitor spending. We can show it by the pie chart here shows that's the our national visitor spending last year was over $20 billion. That's for all the parks. And we can break it down by hotels, groceries, by the different sectors. We can also then show the blue one up at the top shows by states, and it shows which states are generating the most money from visitor spending. And then the one with all the bubbles, that is showing our parks across the country. And the size of the bubble has to do with how much, the bigger the bubble, the more spending that park generates. So from those just three inputs that we were able to produce this information. And so why do we do this? And how do we do it? The important thing is when we communicate our results, this is a key indicator to show how parks can benefit communities and the American public. This is a picture of our infographic that we produce. We have a big rollout every year as our results are released. We have a national, this summarizes the national level impact. Each park also does a rollout too. So we have over 300 parks producing their estimates in the local communities. The media picks this up. It's a way to communicate and like his community outreach needs that park managers can do with their local communities. It's used for planning, policy analysis, NPS leadership, and it's just widely used information. And here's just a little bit more on that. Here's a few of the headlines from our recent result. National parks dramatically influence their local economies. Report confirms Delaware water gap is an economic powerhouse. And in this quote from one of our release back from 2016, I think really summarizes how our information is used as our national parks aren't just fun to explore, they're good for our local and national economies. The next part is sometimes people try to pose conservation against economic development, but it turns out that our studies show that every dollar we invest in national parks generates $10 for local economies. So that's how our results get communicated. And I just wanted to point out really quickly that there are international guidelines that we've been involved in helping out with to be able to just go over these methods that I just quickly showed you as in more detail in this visitors count report. And that is just a very quick summary from my side. If anybody would like more information, please reach out. I'd be happy to discuss. So end it there.
Great, thank you, Lynn. That was great.
Yeah. I think I'll need help getting it off.
I got
Thank you.
Okay.
Right. Joel, you're cutting out. Are you there?
Again, next up, is it, how is it now?
Still coming in and out. Might take you off your webcam.
Yeah, right. Thank you. Next up, I'd like to introduce Mr. Mkhize, International Coordinator for the Greater Limpopo Transfer Area.
Hey, Joel. You're still coming in pretty broken.
Integrated wildlife management. Can
you hear me? I cannot hear you. But I don't want to skip over Mr. Moody's bio before we start this. So if it's okay, I'm going to take over this one. Okay. Oh, we lost him. He's gone. All right. So I'm going to have the honor of introducing Gunyai. He is the International Coordinator for the Great Limpopo Trans-Frontier Conservation Area. Gunyai has 25 years of experience in project management, specializing in environmental conservation, integrated wildlife management, and sustainable community development, mainly within the Great Limpopo TFCA. He holds an MSc in project management, and his professional history includes relevant senior managerial positions in key organizations and institutions within the Great Limpopo TFCA, and rendering consultancy and support services to several international development partners and donor organizations. Mr. Moody excels at implementing complex projects, collaborating with many stakeholders at all scales, and guiding those stakeholders to define project goals and execute a vision to promote wildlife conservation and community development. I'm excited to share a video clip that Gunyai has shared with me, and so I'm going to run that on the Zoom now. I'm going to pull it up and share my screen. And then, so we'll all watch this together. If you have trouble connecting, I will drop the link separately into the chat, and you could watch it separately. And then once the video is over, it's about 5 minutes, we'll come back and discuss a bit. So I'm going to share my screen, share my sound, find my monitor. And then please let me know if this isn't coming through on the chat, either visually or in audio, but I'm going to go ahead and run this.
The Great Limpopo Transfrontier Park and Conservation Area is established through an international treaty between the three countries that was signed by the heads of state in 2002. The treaty basically provides for a two-phased approach. First, establishing the core, which is Limpopo, Kruger and Gonnerazone National Park, with a Sengwe Peace Corridor linking Gonnerazone and Kruger, then a broader conservation area around the core. The treaty also provides for the establishment of a ministerial committee and joint management board to implement the 6 objectives. So the main responsibility for implementing the 6 objectives sits with the joint management board, and this specific process talks to 2 of the 6 objectives, the one being establishment of a regional socio-economic initiative, and the second one is using tourism as a tool or mechanism to realize socio-economic benefits on the ground.
As the Joint Management Board, we partnered with the USAID Resident Program as well as Peace Parks Foundation to then put across a sustainable livelihood strategy that would look at the entire TFCA footprint and prioritize areas that would need further assistance or developing new projects or new proposals of how to beneficiate a larger portion of the communities that are living in and around the projected areas.
We're a development agency that believes in the importance of transboundary cooperation and helping different countries work together, build on each other's skills to both improve livelihoods, but also really to focus on a sustainable future for the region.
We appointed the specialist panel right at the beginning. They were at the inception meeting. It was almost the first thing we did. So we've brought a range of different specialists on that was scoped by the JMB at the beginning, and then we immediately brought them on, and they then helped us define the scope of the research phase and define the process of how we would proceed forward. After the inception phase, we started with a scoping phase, and there we went out, collected existing data that was available, and met and spoke to community representatives and NGOs, civil society, but also at that stage we were really focusing on district level, province level, and national level stakeholders. That all together we then populated into a scoping report, which we then made available to stakeholders in our process. One of the nice and interesting things we've tried to do here is an interactive web-based tool where you can tap into the data and define the perimeters of what you're looking for in that data. So the scenario planning was the first step of 3 workshops. In order for us to know what we need to do to achieve where we want to go, we need to know where it is that we want to go, so we need a vision. We also need to know where we are, and that's what the scoping helped us answer. But before we can say where we are and where we want to go, we also need to understand that the context in which we work is changing. As we design for the future, let's look at what's happening in our context so that we aren't caught off guard, understanding some of those big drivers that are changing the dynamic that we need to be aware of as we design for the future. We then went into a second workshop, and that workshop focused on ecosystem goods and services. We look at the land cover that exists in these areas and project how the natural resources and the ecosystem goods and services that those natural resources provide to people, which form the basis of livelihoods. We need to look at how those are likely to change without any intervention, and then also if we really put enormous amounts of effort into different types of intervention. The third workshop in our process was then to establish and correct the way in which the strategy helps us filter a huge, enormous range of possible interventions to a select strategic few. So we're asking questions about impact and cost and how many people are involved and what the type of impact is, and prioritizing projects on the basis of that. And then that also needs to be fed through a feasibility study, because there are environmental, social, economic costs and impacts that are associated with any intervention. We're developing business plans around a couple of key select projects. And in addition to that, realizing that all interventions are only as good as the more regional context, we're also looking at a landscape level.
Through this strategy, we want to build the resilience of people living around parks. We do this by allowing them to share in the benefits from conservation and by including them and making them part of the effort to protect the incredible biodiversity of Southern Africa.
Okay. Fantastic. Gunyai, could I ask you to, there you are. If you'd like to provide any comments now, that would be wonderful.
Right. So that video was a background in terms of how the whole integrated livelihood diversification strategy process was conducted through the GLTFCA. And I'll just put a little bit of flesh on it. And I think the next speaker, Dr. Kotse, will highlight more in terms of the greater Kruger strategic development strategy for the Great Limpopo Transfrontier Conservation Area. And that will actually highlight probably some of those practical interventions of this strategy. But just to give a bit more information further to the process, the institutional arrangements of the GLTFCA, we have what is called the Joint Management Board. And the Joint Management Board is basically there to guide the policy and the implementation of the activities that come through the GLTFCA. And it was mandated by the Ministerial Committee to be involved in supporting livelihoods of communities in the broader TFCA. And this is enshrined in the TFCA Treaty. And specifically in the development of the integrated livelihood diversification strategy, two key objectives from the treaty were meant to be achieved. And the first one is to facilitate the establishment and maintenance of a sustainable sub-regional economic base through appropriate development frameworks, strategies, and work plans. And the second one is to develop a transboundary ecotourism as a means of fostering regional and socio-economic development. So basically how the structure of the GLTFCA works is the Joint Management Board, it recognizes and builds the efforts of the actors within the landscape that have been working to support the development and livelihoods in the communities around the protected areas. And the JMB also recognizes that it cannot be the engine that drives future livelihood initiatives, but rather it's best placed to play a role of becoming a convener or a facilitator by bringing together a diversity of institutions, people, views, and experiences, thereby facilitating the promotion of an integrated regional development, of a shared vision and understanding of opportunities and ideas. And the JMB also plays a coordinating function by encouraging information sharing and coordination efforts. And lastly, they have a support function that actively empowers the different actors within the GLTFCA landscape. So basically the aim of this strategy was to be able to develop a collective vision and an integrated approach in order to enhance the livelihood options within the GLTFCA. And the process also had to initiate a process to agree and have consensus on a set of strategic priorities, as well as management nodes for priority attention in the first iteration of implementation of this strategy. The strategy was also developed in order to identify viable and sustainable and strategic livelihood initiatives that could be applied to the GLTFCA area, including where existing initiatives are working and can be scaled and shared with the wider audience. I'll elaborate further when I talk about the geographic scope, and also explain that the implementation was initially a pilot that needed to be upscaled and replicated in the other geographic nodes. The aim is also to identify and address prevailing constraints to the success of livelihood initiatives and ensure that current and future threats and tasks, risks that emanate from climate change and other activities such as land issues have been considered when identifying livelihood interventions for resilience of the beneficiary communities. So the process of implementation, how it's achieved and how it's implemented, it provides a mechanism or a platform to support networking between actors across the GLTFCA, and it also facilitates consensus on common approach to monitoring and research that will support improved data-driven management, comparative analysis, and also enhanced impact. It supports good corporate governance, through coordinating existing strategies, priorities, investments, and efforts in order to achieve some synergies and also avoid duplication in certain areas. It seeks to empower communities to actively participate in resource management decisions and support the sharing of different lessons and best practice innovations across groups and regions, including shared information management. We seek to also define responsibilities to ensure that all actors are working towards the competitive advantage, while they also ensure that their activities are being delivered. And also they need to also provide inputs to support proactive fundraising, which is a major constraint in order to demonstrate to investors and donors how their interest can be achieved by supporting our defined priorities. So it's important when such interventions are developed and implemented to understand who the ownership, whose strategy is it, what was it developed for. And according to the GLTFCA treaty, we have implementing agencies in each of the partner states that have been mandated to ensure implementation and coordination of implementation of activities under the GLTFCA in each of the countries. And these are ANAC in Mozambique, SANParks in South Africa, and Zimbabwe Parks and Wildlife Management Authority in Zimbabwe. So they, through the protected areas, they also have a vested interest to share benefits and also to create value for local communities in conservation and other associated activities. So the formal mandate of this socio-economic development is actually vested with them, and they also then work at a partner country level to then engage the different stakeholders in terms of their collaboration and how they then help to facilitate the implementation of the different activities. Currently, the Great Limpopo Transfrontier Conservation Area has been undergoing what we call a revised institutional revamping of the institutional arrangements of the GLTFCA in order for them to be more effective and meaningful in terms of achieving the mandate. And this structure, right at the top, we've got what is called a ministerial committee. Then under the ministerial committee, we have the joint management board, as I've already alluded, who are responsible for policy coordination. And we have the secretariat. Currently, we don't have an active secretariat in the GLTFCA, but we have an international coordinator, and who is myself. And we are hoping that in the very near future, we'll be able to be complemented by a full secretariat at that specific level. Then we have a level where we've got advisory committees and we've got thematic working groups that are in place in order to ensure thematic integration and alignment. And at that level, we have what is called a partners forum. And this is just a forum where the different implementation partners meet. They discuss, they also share ideas and understand the priorities of the GLTFCA. It helps to facilitate a coordinated approach in terms of supporting the different initiatives. We also have 5 thematic technical working groups that are derived from the 10 programmatic areas from the GLTFCA. And they focus on issues such as conservation and wildlife management, security and wildlife protection, tourism and wildlife economy, community and livelihoods, and also human-wildlife conflict. So these working groups become the support structure for the grassroots level structure, which is responsible for implementation and operational functionalities within the GLTFCA, and these are called the Joint Park Management Committees. So I just wanted you to understand the institutional setup of the GLTFCA and how the different interventions under the diversified integrated livelihood diversification strategy actually implemented. So the models that have been developed, there's obviously been consideration for a functional best practice innovation in terms of trying to come up with a functional and sustainable model for the implementation of the sustainable livelihoods diversification strategy. And this has been derived from the DFID sustainable livelihood framework. And essentially how it works is that it doesn't focus on one capital. It actually focuses on the different capitals: human, natural, financial capital, the physical capital, and obviously the social capital is quite broad in its approach. And it ensures that the interventions can be resilient, and they can also be help to absorb any vulnerability in terms of shocks, trends, and seasonality. And it's a very functional model that this livelihood diversified strategy has been developed. So I'll just highlight the existing livelihood models and approaches in the GLTFCA. We have photographic, cultural, adventure, and business tourism. We also have what is called community-based natural resource management, and also wildlife economy, where there is a benefit derived from the utilization of wildlife and natural resources, which includes harvesting, trading, hunting, breeding, processing, marketing, and the sale of wildlife and non-timber forest products. There's also agriculture for the communities, mainly communities that are neighboring wildlife-based land in the broader TFCA. And these communities are engaged in irrigation, conservation, agriculture, and other household use and small-scale trades. They are outgrower. Some of them have arrangements with large-scale commercial farmers. We also have holistic plant grazing, commodity-based trade, where management, marketing, sale of livestock products, and even within the line rate, which is established because of the foot-and-mouth disease. There's also small business development, which I'm sure that the next presenter is going to then allude to the specific projects that have been implemented in the landscape, which also include supplier development and support for formal and informal trade and other conservation-related livelihoods. So the threats that exist to the implementation of these different projects in the different nodes, and that are likely to change the current interventions, are issues such as climate change and water, rainfall variability, water quantity, and population growth. There are demographic changes. There are a lot of migrations. We also have rights issues and recognition, like human rights, land usage, access rights, access to information, procedural, and also decision-making rights. There are also land use decisions, policy and political instability, corruption, bureaucracy, there are economic issues, including global uncertainty, exchange rates, as well as exclusion, inequality, poverty, and unemployment, and diseases. I mean, we've all recently experienced the COVID-19 pandemic and the effects that it has had in terms of the continuity of ongoing programs, and also security threats, including human-wildlife conflict, wildlife crime, general safety and security issues, and also social media associated trends. So a couple of projects, a process went through. 9 nodes geographically were identified within the landscape of the GLTFCA, 9 geographic nodes. And out of the 9 geographic nodes, we were able to lump them up into 4 nodes, developmental nodes, that are known as the Joint Park Management Committee. So depending on where they are, they have state land. They are also sometimes, in some instances, private land, communal land, and so forth. So it's a cross section of stakeholders who come and become a functional structure at the grassroots implementation level. So we have some that are trilateral committees, some that are bilateral. So the strategy looked at these nodes and phased these nodes, the 9 of them, and then grouped them into functional committees or institutions, which are called the Joint Park Management Committees. And as they were also assessing these nodes, they undertook a process on a situation analysis in order to understand the different needs that existed for each of the nodes and the different communities geographically. And once these needs had been identified, they then went into look at the different strategic elements that would then guide in order to assess what kind of interventions needed to be implemented, or the kind of interventions at a nodal level that needed that support. So the 5 different assessments were guided by the strategies, the 5 different strategies. The first strategy it was to protect and restore the natural resources that support livelihoods. And the second one seeks to enhance the ability of local communities to capture the benefits of existing and new livelihood opportunities. The third one looks at empowering people with choices through supporting the development of human, social, productive, and financial capital, thus reducing unstable dependency on diminishing natural capital reserves. The fourth pillar that was used to assess projects at a nodal level was to build effective partnerships and institutions based on trust and collaboration. And the fifth one was to strengthen governance capacity at all levels, including at the community level. So this was the basis of then going into the community, and each of the strategic pillars would focus on a couple of at least 3 to 5 goals that would then look at how those goals would then be achieved and how the different interventions would be determined for each of those areas. And as the video did explain, there was also a process to develop a filter so that when communities do implement a project, there are specific elements or specific strategic objectives that they look at in terms of how that project is going to be, whether that project is worth pursuing. So the filters, 3 key filters were developed in order to filter the different projects. The first one would look at the strategic objectives and align it to the 5 strategic objectives that I've already alluded to. Then the second filter would look at efficiency, effectiveness, and the impacts of that project. Things like cost efficiency, effectiveness of the project in delivering impacts, the nature of its impact, and the scale and the timing. And the third one would then look at the viability considerations, and this would be financial feasibility, the business model of the intervention, the risks, the safeguards, and also interest by potential funders and the market, and stakeholder buy-in and availability of a champion. So I think in a nutshell, this is a strategy, and I'm sure that the other elements in terms of practical implementation are going to be shared through Dr. Marissa's presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Moody. That's great. I want to introduce our next panelist, Dr. Marissa Kotse. She's employed with South Africa National Parks as a general manager, regional integration and planning at Kruger National Park, and she's based there at Kruger. She has primary interest in innovative landscape level protected area management, livelihood practices, and sustainable funding streams. She's coordinated several complex programs at different scales and has knowledge of cooperative and co-management protected area arrangements between private, state, and community structures, biosphere and TFCA landscape arrangements, and mainstreaming conservation management into local and district planning processes. Most recently, Dr. Kotse has overseen the development of the Awalani Protected Environment and Makuleke Contractual National Park Management Plans, the KNP Management Plan Review in 2018, co-developed the Great Limpopo Transfrontier Conservation Area Cooperative Agreement, and co-developed the Greater Kruger Strategic Development Program in 2020. Marissa is passionate about mentoring, participating in creative teamwork, and spending time in the field on operational programs. She loves the outdoors, in particular activities such as open water swimming, camping, running, cycling, and kayaking. Thank you for joining us, Marissa.
Thanks so much for the opportunity, colleagues. I hope I'm audible and that the presentation is visible on your side.
You're definitely audible, and we're waiting to see.
Building on the presentation given by Gwinya from the GLTFCA perspective, this is basically institutionalizing the GLTFCA livelihood diversification strategy that was really foundational for the landscape-based partnership approach on the South African side of the Great Limpopo Transfrontier Conservation Area. Once again, this wasn't done by one person. I've got names of some of my colleagues that participated in it, and it was a process that was developed really over a period of 2 years, and it's dealing with the nuts and the bolts of the implementation, the partnerships at the project level, taking the high-level strategy into local level implementation and learning and adapting through that. In essence, basically, the vision of the Greater Kruger Strategic Development Program is to recognize that human well-being is dependent on a well-managed natural ecosystems and our dependency on that. And we can only attain this at a landscape level through meaningful partnerships, bringing government, communities, and the private sector together to deal with a range of challenges that Gwinya indicated within the broader landscape, hence finding a balance between the conservation, sustainable development in support of the surrounding communities. And I think very important, the GLTFCA treaty allows for the inclusion of community, private, and state entities. And part of this development framework was to provide a replicable model that was going down into the nuts and the bolts through a co-constructed process to identify what those projects are and what the partnership arrangements are from the local level, feeding them back to the district, provincial, national, and regional level. Very important also to address issues of collective challenges, whether it's the human-wildlife conflict, vulnerability around climate change, as well as issues dealing with the illegal wildlife trade, or starting to look at economies of scale and inclusive rural economic development. The Greater Kruger Strategic Development Program, the map then basically shows that for human well-being in the landscape of the Kruger, it starts to look into broader catchment planning processes from the catchment areas and to downstream service delivery to the communities bordering the protected area network, which is shown in green, and then how we respond to our local and district services within the landscape. Our implementation is really guided by 6 strategic objectives, profiling then the landscape according to the different attributes, and the implementation programs, 28 of them, what we call anchor programs embedded in these 6 strategic objectives. And the core objectives, and I will go in a bit of more detail just to highlight what they are, is really securing the natural landscape, understanding the relevance of our environmental ecosystem services for well-being of people, and how that then secures and supports socio-economic transformation and job creation as our core pillars, and putting that into integrated land use planning and management between different sectors at different tiers. And at the heart of the Greater Kruger Strategic Development Program is strengthening partnerships, very much from the bottom up to the top down, and finding the right governance framework or institutions, and mobilizing resources investment based on the gaps identified, and knowledge management, which is crucial in order to see if the interventions need to be adapted. So at the heart then of the Greater Kruger STP is really recognizing that tiered partnership arrangements is vital for implementing a landscape-based partnership approach, with a map showing basically the entry level at traditional authority or land right user level. We've got 54 clusters in the landscape, and that represents the land right user or traditional authority, which is embedded in the district, provincial, and national delineations. And the approach is really looking top down and bottom up. What are those challenges? What are the solutions? What are the projects? And very important, understanding land tenure is vital in terms of the decision making, being consistent, but also recognize that no community is the same, and that project implementation needs to be sensitive for different nuances. It also provides the framework for engagement according to different rules for different institutions, and recognizing that different entities have different capacity, and we need to consider that in the practical implementation, guided in some cases by formal agreements, in other cases basically through stewardship arrangements, and then lastly mobilizing resources, not to all parts within the landscape, but understanding better what are the interventions required for the different aspects or parts within the landscape based on the profiling. And just to go very briefly into the one core pillar, which is really securing the natural landscape, understanding that that is our basis to secure human well-being. There's different anchor programs, which is firstly looking into improving the protected area management effectiveness of the Greater Kruger landscape, Kruger National Park. We've got 16 state, community, and private nature reserve open to the Kruger National Park. And subsequently, we've entered into agreement to collectively see how we can improve management effectiveness from an economic governance and conservation perspective, as well as inclusive rural economic development. Hence the expansion of the protected area network through a range of different models, especially for community land inclusion where they were previously excluded, with the western boundary of the Kruger National Park really being a very hard fence. We've got a population of more or less 4 million people, and different interventions are required in different parts of the landscape. Our strategic water resource management areas are vital in our participation and partnerships with our biospheres, through the Canyon biosphere and the Bibimbi biosphere, in securing those downstream ecosystem services also to Mozambique. And I think at the basis of all our practices and implementation programs is really to harness and unlock responsible environmental management and resource use from the local user up to the management level. Our integrated wildlife management and monitoring within the open landscape is critical around certain species of interest, not limited to rhino and elephant, but also around certain species, informing responsible resource use within the system. Our climate change response plans is then also considered at a landscape level with interventions at the local level, whether it's agricultural, tourism, or infrastructure in our solutions and projects. Coming to the second core pillar, which is really looking into the socio-economic transformation, job creation, and inclusion of communities. It builds then on the foundation of the Greater Kruger STP and the principles that we use in the livelihood strategy in attaining sustainable outcomes from the bottom up, but also guided by strategies at the regional national level. But it's bringing in communities into the center of our economic activities linked to a range of different value streams, and building an enabling partnership ecosystem that is conducive of operating environment. We've learned, and we are still learning a lot, that there are different ingredients that is necessary for this partnership. And that is the stakeholder buy-in, the vision. It cannot be centered around what the protected area would say, or one entity or other. It needs to be understood by different land right users and decision makers within the landscape. And it's really bringing business together at the micro, meso, and the macro scale, looking into what are the trade-offs, the scenarios, and progressing into meaningful change, what we can start to measure, what is the impact in terms of tangible and intangible impacts, improving ecosystem services, but also in terms of job creation and economic transformation, moving us into the era of the community public-private partnerships within the landscape. And just very briefly, what we've scoped out in those different implementation clusters is really to understand what are the value streams and opportunities linked to infrastructure, to the waste economy, to tourism, to the agroeconomies that's compatible with conservation, supply chain opportunities, and then specifically looking into the public-private partnership to further crowdfunding within implementation clusters. I'm going to speak just very briefly to 4 projects that is really trying to pull these partnerships together at the landscape level between different institutions. The first program is the GIZ E4D, which is enterprise development, and it looks at 5 components, basically enterprise development and supply development for communities to have access to different value streams and services linked to the private and the public sector, getting them certified, and better understanding what are the limitations to access these opportunities. Through our Kruger Canyon biosphere, promoting entrepreneurship, through the waste economy, as well as the agri-economy value chains, and through our partner conservation outcomes, looking into unlocking local meat value chains for communities, basically from the point of the offtakes to the SMMEs for the primary and secondary value chains. We also, fundamental to everything that we do, is really applying the responsible resource use, which speaks to waste, to water, to managing our wildlife and all aspects of resources. We had several training interventions in the landscapes of the Wildlife College, and through science parks, upskilling and promoting green entrepreneurships, which is a partnership between the Kruger National Park, private, state, and community areas, and addressing those specific gaps in order then to support offtake agreements in the future. Another program which we are implementing at this point of time as a result of the Greater Kruger SDP that identified specific gaps is a program that's looking into the biodiversity economy and the inclusion of communities in the biodiversity economy. And it's got different elements. It's got elements around community public-private partnerships included in the Kruger estate. Then it's also looking into specifically value chains and improved rangeland management, specifically with regard to the livestock management, considering the foot and mouth disease issues, the infrastructure development and CPP opportunities for communities through that. And then at the heart of it is really to improve communication through our environmental monitor program, which is basically dam scouts supporting area integrity around issues of human-wildlife conflict, and they are deployed in each of these project areas. We communities would like to see their land being included, but then we also look into the trade-offs and other opportunities such as the livestock management and your SMME opportunities. Just to showcase one of our partners who's been part of this entire journey is Indalo Inclusive, and recently having a joint venture partnership adjacent to the Kruger National Park, which is also then a community initiative, once again linked to the broader Greater Kruger brand and the opportunities linked to that, which is then a partnership approach we would like to enhance going forward. I think then the last specific example around how the livelihood strategy in the Greater Kruger SDP start to bring partners together around very practical solutions is the recently launched seasonal crossing, which is an undesignated point between Makuleke Contractual National Park and the Sizwe area within Zimbabwe. And I think what's very important, it's also improving community relationships between Zimbabwe and South Africa, the Makuleke Community Property Association, but it's also looking into the marketing opportunities between different community products within a broader landscape, whilst improving relationships between different states within the TFCA. Looking at the broader landscape, it's very difficult to do everything everywhere. And we developed a prioritization tool based on the livelihood diversification strategy, scoping it further through the Greater Kruger SDP, understanding what are those anchor programs, the economies, and using a decision-making matrix, also looking into different elements like cohesion, governance arrangements, land capability, impact, ease of implementation, and then the required interventions that really moves it into the business prioritization process, whether it's for the wildlife economy or for agriculture or other opportunities at a project level. Part of our initiative this is also a network, similar to what was presented earlier, and contribution to leisure tourism, the hunting tourism, protected area management and social investment. This is part of the assessment that was done for the GLTFCA cooperative agreement. It's all the protected areas open to the Kruger National Park. At this point of time, we participated from a national park to contractual national parks and 6 private nature reserves. Also looking to the contribution of jobs, value to the GDP, taxes generated and income generated in terms of your direct, indirect, and your induced contributions. This is critical for us also to make the case in terms of the protected area as a major land use in the landscape, contributing to well-being directly and indirectly, but also to assist further with mobilizing resources around shortfalls. This then led to a program that we are starting now, the Greater Kruger Financing Strategy, funded through the IFC, and with our partnerships, Conservation South Africa, EMS, Endangered Wildlife Trust, and Rand Merchant Bank, which has basically been using the program scoped out through the Greater Kruger Strategic Development Program, looking at it through a nature positive lens for investment, using the prioritization criteria, and looking from a market investor interest opposed to the solutions required from a local implementation level. In the future, that might lead into looking into different mechanisms or platforms for the financing strategy. At this point of time, it's looking into different interventions at different scales. Very important is through the assessment tools then to pool or bundle together different projects and investable products, and building then on the existing priorities identified in the landscape with partners. Coming to a very important slide is strengthening our data and knowledge management. We recently had with one of the notes, the Kruger Canyon Biosphere, a reflection of what is new with the Greater Kruger Strategic Development Program. Do we have a collective vision? What are the new emerging matters? How do we need to respond to it? And what are the partnerships that is also required to ensure implementation at the local level? And how do we assess that? Besides the knowledge products that we've developed, several guidelines, assessment tools. This is a specific assessment tool by the Kruger Canyons, looking at the interventions from invasive alien species in hydrological modeling to protected area expansion, burning restoration, grazing management, biodiversity prioritization, what those inputs are, what the outputs are, and this forms part of a monitoring, evaluation, and learning system. Coming to the point of especially how did we get through COVID or lessons learned, and this is a study that was done through the Sustainable Wildlife Economies Project, not within our landscape per se, but some lessons learned and which we need to apply in our landscape is that areas that seem to be more resilient were economies and livelihoods which had a mixed livestock, mixed wildlife combination, opposed to specific economies that were either wildlife or livestock. And this was then crucial also for us in the landscape to identify what are those diversified livelihoods or economy to ensure sustainability at the local and the landscape level. Just to conclude, really there are some critical success factors, and it's vital to have champions at the strategic level, at the nodal level, but mostly at the project implementation level. That is basically the people that's carrying the heart, who are our custodians with the youth, with communities, to implement the solutions and to reflect continuously. Continuous operational development and maintaining the momentum is critical. Trust is developed over time, and a stop-and-go process, especially from a funding, do not yield the intended outcomes of a landscape partnership approach. It is very important to understand the clear institutional framework and partnership approach, our entry points at the local level with communities through the traditional councils, royal families, or community property associations, but also how that relates to our local district, provincial services, and our biospheres. Ownership and accountability in terms of responsible resource use is vital, and our interventions are only as good as land right users take ownership and accountability, recognizing that our interventions should include capacity development and communication and information sharing in a way relevant to that specific stakeholder group. What we've seen over the years and from the development of the livelihood diversification strategy is that success breeds success, and that helps to maintain multi-year momentum between different partners. In the end, to achieve a landscape-based partnership approach, we might not be able to reach all 4 million people, but it is important that the different parts of people or communities or beneficiaries participating in it should add value more than the individual parts. Thanks, that's my presentation. And I would like to acknowledge my team who's also in the specific webinar.
Okay. Thank you so much, Marissa. It was a wealth of information and we really appreciate it. We are short on time and we have some great questions. I don't think we're going to be able to get to all of them. I first wanted to point out there were a couple of questions for Lynn in the chat, and Lynn did follow up and respond to those. We will provide those in our follow-up email. So if you're curious about those questions and responses, you can see them there. I want to get quickly to first I want to invite anyone who wants to submit a question in the chat to please do so. If we don't get to it today, we can follow up with our speakers and see if we can provide you with a response afterwards. We'll also share several resources that have been shared today on the call in our follow-up email. But the question that I want to start with from Stefania is, I think, mostly directed at Gunyai and Marissa, and it's about how specifically do you involve local communities at a practical level in strategy identification? Who are there? Local community representatives? Do you use facilitators? And is there any cultural gap between managers and local communities and the different local communities that has to be managed to reach dialogue? How do you work with this process?
Okay, perhaps I can start off. From an institutional level, I did give an outline in terms of the institutional arrangements that exist within the GLTFCA. Now, at an implementation level, we have a structure that is called the Joint Park Management Committees. These Joint Park Management Committees are developed at park level, at implementation level, and they are responsible mainly for implementation of the projects at the landscape level. Now, how these are constituted is we do have community representation. We also have representation from different government departments, extension workers, and in some cases also private sector individuals who are on the ground and part and parcel of the implementation process of the projects. So from an institutional setup and complementing the entire structure of the GLTFCA, there is adequate engagement at a community level through the Drain Park Management Committees. And so those communities are also well informed in terms of what is happening, and they also participate in the decision-making process. And I'm sure that from a PPCP, private-public community partnership level, I'm sure that Marissa has also alluded to a couple of different community beneficiation interventions that are happening, especially on the Kruger side. And I'll probably also give an opportunity to explain how it functions there. Thank you.
Thank you. Marissa, anything to add?
Thanks so much, Gunya. So specifically within the Greater Kruger landscape, we do have specific institutions and entry points for the communities at different levels. So we've got a community forums. 7 of the community forums basically serve as platforms for information sharing around what we do in the protected areas, opportunities, whether it's linked to projects or linked to jobs or dealing with challenges around human-wildlife conflict. But we do have, and it's quite complex, the landscape, because it's depending on the objective that you would use different entry points for different community structures. We've got 39 traditional authorities bordering the Kruger National Park. And within that, they do then have different tiers, the Royal Family, Traditional Council, they've got Community Development Forum. So in the end, it really comes back to what your specific objective of engagement is. We also have people and park structures, which is oversight structure, reporting to the national level, especially around strategy. And then at a very specific project level, we are either dealing with community property associations, for instance, in the case of Makuleki Contractual Park, through the specific management and the co-management in that area. In other cases, we are dealing with community trusts or NPCs for community land being included. In other cases, we are moving towards a community public-private partnership, which is guided by the Sandbox commercialization strategy. And it's really recognizing that communities are central to our value chains. What it means, looking at all these different options, is I don't think one can ever over-communicate, but communication needs to be consistent for the specific objective of your program, and it needs to be communicated through the right platform. For that, we've got socio-economic transformation officers, community liaison officers, and project managers that's really dealing with it on a day-to-day basis. And they are vital. Without that, there is definitely going to be a gap between the management and what's happening at the community level. And they are vital in terms of our project implementation, as well as our relationships and communicating aspects relevant to communities, what affects them.
It's great. I was going to, we have another question that came up that we wanted to have hear everybody's feedback on and thoughts. That is, what kinds of investment projects or capacity building would be most helpful for working towards climate adaptation and resilience in parks?
So I was thinking about this question specifically from a livelihoods perspective. You know, Marissa and Gunya both talked about agriculture, community-based natural resource management, wildlife economy, many other livelihoods that that projects are being invested in and interventions are being made to support. What have you thought about? Is there conversation about changes that are happening on the ground or may happen in the future related to? Someone did allude to this, drying landscapes or wildfire, other effects of climate change, how do you talk about that, and how do you plan for those changes and their impacts on these livelihoods?
Thanks, Melanie. I'll respond. Sorry, I couldn't hear the initial question. I think looking in terms of vulnerability of communities and dealing with some of the challenges that we are dealing with, and what we need to discuss is certainly vulnerability with regard to climate change events, looking specifically into droughts, how that impacts on livelihoods around agricultural aspects, whether it's livestock management or your agro-cropping. A big issue within our landscape is looking into improved land use planning, specifically where we do have settlements very often being developed in areas that's prone to floods. We also deal with food insecurities, looking specifically either in the cropping technique being used or the specific crops being used. And then there are other impacts, diseases. I think what is very vital at a project level is for us, when we are doing the planning with communities, is to understand what these risks are, what the limitations are, and very often it's about information sharing, but it's also developing tools at the level relevant for the specific stakeholder. We do have interventions around invasive alien species clearing, restoring land, but I think it's quite complex in the landscape, and there's no set of solutions relevant only to one community level, but that it is forming part of our planning at the landscape level, as well as at the community project level. It is true, it is very important, but we require much more capacity in order to use those specific tools at the planning level. Unfortunately, it doesn't always translate at the policy level. We do have policy planning processes, which is not taking into consideration the local community situation, which we need to bridge.
Okay, great, thank you. Trying to decide if we have time for one more question, but I don't think we do. I do want to end us at the top of the hour. Again, I will ask follow-up questions to our panelists and try to provide those to you in our follow-up email. But very quickly, I'm going to share my screen here. And okay, well, so thank you very much for joining today. Thank you to our panelists. I want to just real quick introduce the next phase of the project, but also remind you that there is a repository online for all of these webinars and the recordings, the last 7 sessions. Don't forget to go view, click on them, share them if they seem of interest to you. And also stay tuned, look for more information in your inbox about what comes of this next phase. We expect to have another session in January with our colleagues at South African National Parks. And I really want to thank you again for coming. Thank you so much to our panelists. We will follow up by email with any other unresolved questions. I really, really appreciate you taking the time to join us today, Gunyai and Marissa and Lynn. It's been fascinating, and I wish we had more time to discuss, and perhaps we'll have to have a follow-on session to do so. But for now, we will close out this session. And again, thanks for joining.
Thank you, everybody, and thank you, Melanie, for coordinating that.
My pleasure. It is bright and cold and snowy, and the sunrise is right in my eyes right now. So have a great afternoon to all of those on the other side of the world.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.